The Memphis Grizzlies have a couple roster questions to answer. If you count them, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 17 players who have a chance to make the 15-man roster, and someone's gonna miss the cut. We're gonna tell you who that could be coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your co-host, Damichael here, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal here in Memphis, Tennessee, joined by my esteemed co-host here, Joe Mullinax.
God, I can't do that anymore. I got to get used to this YouTube video thing. My hairline is terrible.
And I must add, joined by a cooler Joe Mullinax today after the John Morant and the whole spiel with the GM survey. If you haven't checked out yesterday's Locked On Grizzlies episode, go check that out. You're going to see a more animated version of Joe on that episode. But we appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies. We appreciate you making this your first listen each and every morning. And just remember, we're everywhere like the air. If you want to go over there to Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you like podcasts, that's where we are. YouTube as well, and you can watch us on YouTube. So we see your we see your reviews, we see your comments, we see the things that you're saying. We appreciate you. We take all of that into account with each and every episode, hoping to make things better for you. So we appreciate you on that end, and we appreciate you for following the Grizzlies and our coverage of that. And speaking of the Grizzlies, Joe, some interesting things, are going on here. I wasn't the greatest at math. I was decent at math in high school and in a couple of the classes. I think I was all right in algebra. Calculus, I was decent, but geometry, trigonometry, when you throw those shapes in there, right, things didn't go as well. But tell you what, with the way that the Grizzlies roster is sizing up, someone's going to get the short end of the stick here, Joe. I did some counting, and with the way the Grizzlies roster is constructed, you have about 18 guys who a lot of people in the Grizzlies fan base would deem impactful. And when I say impactful, these are players who were either drafted this past season or players who played roles, last season, the year before that, and so forth. So, and when I say drafted this past season, I'm including Kenneth Lofton Jr. In that group as well. So you have 18 players who impact the Grizzlies from that standpoint, and two-way contracts, Vince Williams and Jr., Kenneth Lofton Jr. So you got 16 guys battling for 15 spots on the 15-man roster. Someone's going to get the short end of the stick, Joe.
Yes, and first off, I just want to apologize to everyone that is listening, watching, however you're taking in this content here on Locked On Grizzlies. I want to apologize for absolutely nothing, NBA GMs. You say sorry first, and then I'll apologize for my reaction. I did some yoga today. I did some breathing exercises, and I'm feeling much better. So we can move forward, and everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's not going to be okay for somebody on this Grizzlies roster currently in terms of having a job. And to me, the easiest answer, and I think you and you're in a little bit different spot. You cover the team every day. You're there on the ground, in the locker room, which I'm glad that's happening again post-COVID here. Chance for you to make relationships with the players, that sort of stuff. A little more personable work for you. Makes your job easier. So maybe you can't be as direct as me. I can be direct and say it's going to be Killian Tilly. And I hate that for him because I see the value in Killian Tilly. And I think that one of the cool things, sorry, don't mean it in that way. Once he is waived, I'm not sure that anybody else is going to be trying to get him on a deal where he comes in on their G League team. So this could be a guy that makes his way back to the Memphis Hustle and he stays in the system. I think that's possible. But as you know, it's easy sometimes when we do these analysis pieces and these shows there's one guy that's not able to stay on the floor, right? There's one guy who had a variety of ailments from knees to issues with his back. The theoretical fit of Killian Tilly is fantastic. Being a big that can space the floor at a high level, can do a lot of things that Taylor Jenkins values, especially in that half-court offense. We talk so much about improving the half-court offense. Killian Tilly, the idea of him, can do just that. But at this point, that's exactly all he is an idea. And if you can't be on the floor, you can't help the team in terms of winning. So if you got 15 spots and there's 16 guys and there's one who just can't seem to stay healthy, the decision kind of makes itself, Damichael.
Yeah, you mentioned it, and that's the biggest thing here with Killian Tilly. When I was talking to him at Media Days, it kind of surprised me because we had this long conversation because I asked him, last season, he kind of was on the injury report. If you remember, it was soreness Absolutely. At first. It was soreness in December, mid-December, late December, and he just stayed on the injury report. And he just stayed on the injury report, and he just stayed on the injury report.
He lived there. He got a lease. He got a lease on the injury report.
And he never came off. So with that being said, he talked about how, this injury has been difficult for him and, just the adjustments there. And, he was asked him, was he healthy yet? And he said he's still not 100%. Looking at him, I mean, it's tough because I saw Killian Tilly, he's been working really hard. He was one of the players. I talked about Dillon Brooks going out there in Las Vegas and working out with the Summer League Grizzlies. Killian Tilly was the other. And when I tell you he was shooting the basketball good, he wasn't missing, Joe. You could clearly tell he was one of the best shooters out there between the Summer League Grizzlies and Dillon Brooks. That guy was filling the ball through the net. And you see the potential, especially for this roster, right? This team is filling up with those guys who can play the three, who can play the four. What positions has Killian Tilly played in his time with the Grizzlies? The three, the four. He is what this team kind of needs, so to speak. But again, that's why I started off with saying this team has 16 guys who are capable of making impacts. Someone's going to get the short end of the stick. Joe says Killian Tilly is the most likely option. I kind of agree there. And, I mean, it's a tough spot. Like I said, a lot of teams, you don't have 16 guys who have either been in this system and played actual games on the floor or are guys they just drafted this past season who they're obviously going to invest in. Kenneth Lofton Jr. isn't going anywhere. Vince Williams is on a 2-way contract as well. And Kennedy Chandler just got one of the best second-round deals for, a second-round pick in NBA history. And the first-round guys definitely aren't going anywhere. So it's like a process of elimination. Exactly. So it's a process of elimination thing here. And when you just do the math, you do the numbers, I guess this episode we're going to be talking a lot about the math, right? The math right now it's not adding up for Tilly.
Yeah, just don't go too far into the numbers. I'll have to take off my socks and my shoes and count my toes. You're doing calculus over there. I'm happy with multiplication tables.
So you don't have 10 toes.
Whew, gosh, I'd have to look. I don't even know anymore. I think that the biggest thing for Killian Tilly is the best ability in life at times is availability.
Yep.
Right. And I think that is the greatest challenge for him is the theoretical fit, like we talked about. Looking at him at playing the three sounds like a completely awful idea in terms of defense, lateral movement. There's a lot of concern there, at least there was for me. But Damichael, you make a fair point. When he was at the three, he didn't look terrible. He actually fit within the defensive scheme, the way that they've rotated, creating deflections. It was a cleaner role for him than I anticipated. So you hate it because he is that tweener combo forward that can space the floor, that in theory can help make the life of Ja Morant, Tyus Jones, driving on a floater off of a pick and pop look with Tilly. The possibilities are there, but if you can't stay healthy, if you can't apply the skills, and this goes back to his career in Gonzaga, right? That's one of the reasons he was a lottery talent that fell out of that part of the draft because of injury concerns. The Grizzlies took a shot on him. They brought him in. He showed flashes of why he was that lottery talent. But the reality is he's just continuing to struggle. And I would not place any wagers on Killian Tilly being with the Memphis Grizzlies coming out of cuts. I don't even know if that is an available wager on betonline.net, but I can tell you right now that if you are interested, whether it's NBA betting information, whether it's football betting information, betonline.net is your number one source for football, basketball, any betting info this season. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game that you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information, live betting, up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there, Major League Baseball, NBA, NFL, literally anything that you can possibly imagine, BetOnline has you covered. Every sport, even boxing, even golf, head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Damichael, it's not quite as interesting with the cuts because I think that Killian Tilly, as we mentioned in the previous segment, not longed for this Grizzlies world. And I take no pleasure in that, right? This is somebody that's losing their opportunity at the NBA. Maybe he gets another chance with the G League like we talked about. There's lots of flexibility there. But you don't take pride in being right about that, right? You want these guys to have success, especially you, again, having the chance to develop those personal relationships, actually putting a face to the guy that's going to get cut. That's not something you're excited about. What is most interesting to me with this roster bubble conversation is not necessarily the cuts, because again, the greatest ability is availability. It is the rotation. Because as you alluded to in your preview on our last episode, you did a very good job with that, by the way. It's almost like you're a professional. You mentioned how there's a guy who started playoff games for the Memphis Grizzlies not too long ago, who is currently did not play coach's decision in the preseason when all the rotation pieces or most of the rotation pieces are actively playing. I know that you and others have asked Taylor Jenkins and asked around about Xavier Tillman and his role. It seems unlikely that Xavier Tillman gets cut, but he already appears cut out of the rotation, at least for now, and that bears watching, doesn't it?
It does, because this is one of the guys who was mentioned in the the starting power forward conversation. And in fact, if I remember correctly, a couple seasons ago on Martin Luther King Day against the Suns, he started, in that same role. So this is a guy who has starting regular season experience with these young Grizzlies. This is a guy who started playoff games with this team, and they needed him. He provided a big boost against the Timberwolves in that series, especially when he came in for Steven Adams, in that first game. But with that being said, Xavier Tillman is a guy who in Summer League, I came out and said it straight up. For him to be a third-year guy, I expected him to dominate a little bit more. Now, granted, we know, the offensive gaudy numbers has never been Xavier Tillman's game at the NBA level, but still, I felt like we should have seen 12 points, 8 rebounds, type numbers. We should have seen, you're in Summer League to show advanced skill set stuff. Zaire Williams was there because he's working on, his ball handling and things
Desmond
like
Bane
that. Desmond Bane the year before. Santi Aldama, a big emphasis for him at Summer League this past year was physicality. He talked about being in the gym more, taking hits more, things like that. That's why they played him at the 5 a lot in Summer League. But with Xavier Tillman, I was like, okay, maybe we're going to see him shoot some three-pointers. Maybe we're going to see him do a little bit more off the dribbles, a back to the basket hook shot.
Even, sorry to interrupt you, but even in a role similar to Steven Adams.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe he's the guy on the elbow facilitating offense like Marc Gasol used to do back in the day.
Exactly.
Something where he had a larger role.
Exactly. And what I saw was, quite frankly, he looked like regular season and playoff Xavier Tillman. He great defensively, making an impact there, rebounding the basketball, but not much more. So what I got out of that is a limited ceiling. You wanted to see, oh wow, Xavier Tillman shooting 3-pointers now, or wow, look at the way he's passing the ball out of these sets and things like that. Imagine if he's passing that to Ja. I didn't see anyone saying anything like that, and I didn't get those thoughts myself. So with that being said, it's looking like he's getting the short end of the stick here. And you mentioned it earlier. I did talk to Taylor Jenkins about this, and he kind of brought it up yesterday when we talked to him at the Grizzlies bowling night event. He brought it up again that Xavier Tillman is going to get, more opportunity here in the preseason. So I would expect him to play in this upcoming game against the Miami Heat on Friday just to get more run there. Not a lot, I don't think, but they're going to throw him out there. Taylor Jenkins has talked about playing around more with lineup rotations and things like that. He's going to get his chance, but clearly, if you go through the first two games, Joe, he's the guy of everyone on the roster right now who's getting the short end of the stick.
And it's a lack of versatility, as you alluded to. When you think of positionless basketball, right? That's the buzzword that my replacement over at grizzlybearblues.com, Parker Fleming, he talks about positionless basketball all the time. And I like to give him a hard time about that. That and gravity, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I already yelled enough for this week. I think that if you're going to look at the versatility aspect, that's a better way to describe it for me. I want guys that can do multiple things. And Xavier Tillman is kind of a one-trick pony in a lot of ways, not necessarily in terms of not being a good teammate, being a good person. Obviously, he has the relationship with Jaren Jackson Jr. When we talk about that sort of thing, we're focusing on the basketball side. And when you think about Xavier Tillman, you think about the ability to switch defensively. He has great switchability. He can do some of the stuff that Brandon Clark does. He has very good lateral quickness, more than he appears to have. He did a great job in his playoff appearances, showing that and showcasing that, especially on driving guards, shuffling his feet, getting in front, making life difficult around the baseline and the rim for guys that are penetrating both on and off the dribble. That's all good stuff for Xavier Tillman. But what else? Right? What else? And I think that the comp that I can make to Michael is Kyle Anderson in a way. Because Kyle Anderson is a good basketball player in every way, except he can't score, right? Consistently, at least. He is not an offensive weapon. And Xavier Tillman does less than Kyle Anderson. He's not that facilitator. At least he hasn't shown it consistently. He certainly isn't a creator off the dribble. He doesn't have the skill set that even a Kyle Anderson does. Plus, he doesn't bring that scoring acumen to the fold. He's not a Kenneth Lofton Jr. even in that way. So I think with X, you know what you're getting with him. It's almost a devil that you know versus the devil that you don't, in terms of, he's going to play hard. He's a good locker room fit. He's good friends with Jaren, like I mentioned a moment ago. He's a guy that fits what they want to be. And he fits the mental makeup and the cultural aspect of being overlooked. I mean, I'm kind of overlooking him in this conversation right now. So it all aligns for him to still be on the roster, of course. Like I said, at least X is healthy and can play. Killian Tilly can't. That kind of makes that decision. But if you're telling me it's between Jake LaRavia and Xavier Tillman, if you're telling me it's between David Roddy and Xavier Tillman for that 10th roster spot, or not 10th roster spot, rotation spot, then I kind of want to see what the young kids can do. I kind of want to see what Roddy can do in that Kyle Anderson 2.0 kind of role. I want to see what LaRavia can be. Maybe he's not Mike Miller, but even if he's a poor man's Mike Miller, that provides floor spacing that Xavier Tillman can't provide. So versatility, I think that there's a higher ceiling for that. And that was a great term by you. There's a higher ceiling for the guys that are probably in front of X for playing time. X is a guy that if injuries occur, he can come in, give you 12 minutes. He's not going to kill you, but he's not going to help take over a game. He's not going to help start an offensive run unless it's in some defensive transition opportunity. His scope is limited in terms of how he's going to help you win beyond the one thing that he's above average to pretty good at.
Right. He's we're not saying he's a bad player here. It's more about, at the end of the day, we're having this conversation because the Grizzlies are deep. I mean, as Taylor Jenkins even said it to me, himself, this is just a product of their depth. It's a great problem to have. You have so many players that one of your players who started a playoff game is a guy we're talking about being a potential 15th or 14th man, on a roster. And I mean, that says enough in itself. But at the end of the day, you look at where Xavier Tillman could play. You look at the 4 spots and the 5 spots. I think the 4 is where he's really lacking behind right now. It looks like those rookies that you mentioned, Jake LaRavia, David Roddy, are ahead of him right now. And Steven Adams actually gave me a good tidbit on David Roddy by saying that Roddy right now is kind of ahead of the curve defensively as far as the rookies go. He's catching on.
That matters a ton.
And we've talked about it with Taylor Jenkins. Defensive versatility is a huge component of this defense. It's the number one thing in determining who gets playing time, and then you build it out from there. David Roddy's ahead of the curve there, so that was an interesting tidbit from Steven Adams as well. But on top of that, you have those guys, and then Santi Aldama in his progression. So you move over to center. Steven Adams and Brandon Clark are going to get the bulk of the minutes there, unless one of those guys is injured or in foul trouble. It's just not enough minutes to go around. So with that being said, I think there's still the potential of X to impact this roster unless one thing happens. So, and it kind of resolves around a guy that at FedEx Forum on Monday had the crowd chanting, "We want Kenny."
Memphis sure does love them some big guys that can score the basketball. We'll talk more about old Junior himself coming back up on Locked On Grizzlies. Kenny Lofton Jr. I tell you what, Damichael, it really is something to watch Memphis fall for dudes that don't look like they should be good at basketball, right? And I think that Kenneth Lofton Jr. is the next in a long line of physically flawed. And I sound like I'm trashing. Trust me, I'm physically flawed. But when you look at Kenny Lofton Jr., he is not your prototypical NBA athlete. He's just not. I'm not going to go beyond in terms of his frame. He's just not built the way that when you think of a top NBA player, the way that they're built, he's just not. He's unique in that way. But Memphis loves those guys. Tony Allen, unique basketball player. Zach Randolph, unique basketball player. You go up and down Memphis Grizzlies history, Memphis has a thing for these kinds of players, and Kenny Lofton Jr. just seems to be the next in a long line. I know that he is on a two-way contract, and there's already talk of converting him to a full roster spot, but that would mean that someone else would have to go. So I guess I can start off this final segment here, Damichael, with asking you, who would that even be? Because I think it's okay to get excited for what he can be. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense for me to let him develop down in South Haven. And then when the freedom of the offseason comes, where you're a little more flexible in terms of the kinds of moves you can make, maybe you can, and I don't have the structure of his deal in front of me. I think usually they sign multi-year two-way contracts. So I'm guessing it's similar to that. You can always convert him in the future. Let him go dominate the G League. Let him go sell some tickets for the Memphis Hustle. That would be my thought, because if you want to convert him to a full NBA player now, that means that you're cutting someone else. And I'm just not sure that someone else is on the roster beyond Killian Tilly.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation because you have all the fans, and rightfully so. I think Grizzlies fans, the fan base, should be demanding to see more of Kenny Lofton Jr. based off what we saw, 17 points, 6 of 8 from the field, and then he gets a DNP. I thought he definitely deserves to see the floor a little bit more. But just like in anything, there are politics involved in basketball. There are some things behind the scenes in terms of just out of certain people's control here. And one of those things is his contract situation. As a two-way guy, first of all, that was an excellent find, by the Memphis Grizzlies. And it was an excellent find, because the Grizzlies were successful last season. I was talking with Kenneth Lofton Jr. The other day, and what appealed to him about the Grizzlies? Why did he want to sign there? He said he wanted to go play for a contender. He told his agent, I want to play for a contender. The Grizzlies reached out, and here he is. That's why he's in Memphis. There's no other reason other than he wanted to play for a team that could compete for a championship. So with that being said, Kenneth Lofton Jr.'s situation, as a two-way player, you only can be on the roster for a certain amount of games during the regular season. And the most important thing, at least I think, is you're not eligible for the postseason roster. Mm-hmm. So when you're weighing what to do with Kenneth Lofton Jr. here, I think the main question that has to be answered, Joe, is this a guy we expect to be in the playoff rotation? When the rotation gets smaller, when we're talking 8-9 guys are playing, Is this is a guy we expect to be one of those 9 players? If the answer is no, keep him on a 2-way contract, because it's simply not worth, possibly removing a guy. Let's say it's Xavier Tillman in that case. If Steven Adams gets hurt and now you're starting Brandon Clark or Santi Aldama or one of those guys, Xavier Tillman is going to be a very valuable backup. And in that situation, and then you're limited depth at the 5, because you're not bringing Kenneth Lofton Jr. up more than likely to play the 5. There are some defensive things, there that I remember in the summer when I was talking with David McClure, who works a lot with the big men, and he was the Grizzlies head coach in the summer league. He was telling me how defensively right now they're working on, helping Kenneth Lofton Jr., play the Grizzlies brand of basketball. When we talk about defensive versatility is the main thing with the Grizzlies to help you get on the court. He hasn't provided that just yet. He hasn't been put in those situations too. When you see him on defense a lot, it's a lot of hedges and things like that. There aren't a lot of situations of him having to switch out and guard these guys. So at the end of the day, Joe, it comes down to that one question. Is this a guy you could pencil in as one of your 8-9 guys? I think offensively, the potential is there. But what say you, Joe?
Offensively, sure. But your point about the playoffs is a great one. If your rotation, assuming everyone's healthy, which, is a big assumption.
Yep.
Ja, Bane, Brooks, and again, assuming there's no trades. Ja, Bane, Brooks, Jaren, Adams, Tyus, Conchar, Williams, Clark. Right? Like that's probably
healthy Danny Green.
Maybe healthy Danny Green. I'll believe it when I see it. But my point is he'd be 10th, right? 9th or 10th. So you don't have space for Kenneth Lofton Jr. And that's just another, post to the argument of keeping him in the G League. I am concerned about his defense. I'm concerned about exactly what you said. He would be a target. Right. And you've already got guys like Ja Morant. And in fairness to Ja, he is focused on his defense. He's said that multiple times. You saw it in the preseason game where he played. He is trying to be a better 2-way player. And I believe there's no reason with his athleticism that he can't be, aside from just being exhausted because he's so important offensively. And you can't lose that, obviously, either. So I think that you already have guys that can be targeted, right, in a potential playoff series. If you're going to get to the NBA Finals, who do you have to go through? You got to go through Golden State. You got to go through the Clippers. You got to go through somebody like that, the Phoenix Suns. And they have dudes, especially in their reserves, especially at the big positions, that can hurt you. They can make a lot of different moves to put players like Lofton in a bind. Would you rather it be Brandon Clark? Would you rather it be somebody that has the opportunity, even a Xavier Tillman, who has experience in that position? Yes, he's not as offensively explosive as Lofton Jr., but we also haven't seen Kenny Lofton Jr. play in an actual NBA game yet. No disrespect to the Summer League, no disrespect to preseason games, but let's wait until there's a game where he's going up against Anthony Davis, assuming he actually plays. He's already on an injury report. Let's wait until there's a game where he is against Mikal Bridges at the 4. Right? Like, let's wait until there's a time where it's actually a Wednesday night in the National Basketball Association's regular season, and he gets a chance to play on that 2-way contract. Let's see how he does when the games actually count. I think that we get ahead of ourselves sometimes, not just as Grizzlies fans, but as fans of sports in general. We see something that's special, something that's fun. We want to accelerate it. We want it to be better than it is in that moment. I'm guilty of that with this Grizzlies team and trying to be more contender behavior specific in their front office. I'm guilty of that to an extent in that way. I think that as a fan base with the Grizzlies, in particular with Lofton Jr., you are asking for something that A, would go against their roster construction, and B, would not necessarily be best for Kenny Lofton Jr. as he gets used to playing NBA caliber competition. I think that his current structured deal makes all the sense in the world, and you reevaluate whenever the Grizzlies season ends in the spring and hopefully early summer.
Yeah. So if you look at his style of play, he's tailor-made to be an offensive star.
Sure.
He has the post polish right now. We just saw him going at Brook Lopez and Serge Ibaka. I think Anthony Davis is an all-world defender. But Brook Lopez ain't too shabby. And Serge Ibaka used to have the nickname Serge, I block you for a reason. So with that being said,
but again, it's a preseason game.
Yeah, but I mean, you think they're just going to let a rookie go at him, Joe? There's some
in the
pride
preseason.
there.
I'm not sure they care, Damichael. I'm not sure they care.
These NBA players have egos. They're prideful.
But it's the preseason.
I'm not letting a rookie just go at me into my chest on multiple plays. At some point, I said, look, I got to teach this rookie a lesson. And I mean, maybe they were. I mean, they are, they're a championship type team. So maybe they are, this is just preseason focusing on health.
Yeah, but Golden State is like that on games in March.
On the regular season. Yeah, exactly. But with Kenneth Lofton Jr., the thing is, defensively, I don't think he's a terrible defender by any means. I've seen him make plays with his hands. He has some really quick hands. He's one of those guys who can get steals. He's not going to get the above the rim play, but he is very capable of getting those steals. He has some really quick hands. He is defensively gifted in that way, but the limited athleticism. Someone told me I have really good relationships with a lot of pro basketball players overseas, and a lot of the guys tell me the same thing. The NBA is not home to the most skilled basketball players. It's home to the best athletes. That's why a lot of guys overseas, are guys who are very good one-on-one scorers, individual scorers, and things like that, but they don't have 37, 38-inch verticals, and they don't shine in the NBA combine. So, a la basically a Kenneth Lofton Jr. And my point here, Joe, is people compare him, for example, to Zach Randolph a lot. And when I say people, I've heard it from people as close as like Bonzi Wells. Bonzi Wells is the close friend of Zach Randolph. For those who don't know, he's also a former Memphis Grizzlies player as well. He's now the head coach at Lemoyne College here in Memphis, Tennessee. But Bonzi Wells and me, we were having a chit chat one day where he just told me, look, he reminds me of Zebo, and this is what he said, Joe. He said, not Grizzlies Zebo. I'm talking about young Zebo.
Right.
And he doubled down on it. He said, I'm talking about young Zebo. Bonzi Wells has known Zach Randolph since he was 13 years old. So if Bonzi Wells, who grew up with Zach Randolph, says that, then I think that's about as good as a vouch as you can get. But the thing is, when people factor that in, they have to remember the NBA is different now than when Zebo played in the league. Zebo played when 4s and 5s were primarily both inside of the three-point line most of the time. The name of the game now is space and pace. It's a completely different league, which means, a guy like Zebo 20 years ago, even with his style of play, he probably wouldn't have started for a lot of teams because of the way the game is just going now. Think of a guy like Jahlil Okafor, if you Locked On Grizzlies fans, if you remember him. This was a guy who was the number 3 overall pick in a draft and, was insanely offensively gifted at Duke, but did not fit the current structure of the NBA. So he's gone. He just is not a fit anymore. DeMarcus Cousins now, he's getting slower on his feet. Not a fit in the league anymore. He's unsigned right now. So with all that being said, I think with Kenneth Lofton Jr., it all comes down to how he progresses defensively. But the offensive gift, Joe, it's going to be hard to keep that dude off the floor.
He has time to develop. Just be patient, everybody. Take a deep breath. Like me today, calming down about John Morant not getting a single vote in the NBA GM Summer. Calm down. Everything's going to be fine. Deep breaths. Kenneth Lofton Jr. is in the plans. Let him develop. Thanks again for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Make sure that you check out the Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview starting October 10th. This is a 6-episode extravaganza to get you ready for the NBA season. Local team experts, NBA insiders of the Locked On Podcast Network, and Odyssey, all combining into one ultimate NBA preview. Starting October 10th, search for Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview 2022 on your Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Damichael, tomorrow you're flying solo again. What are some possible topics for your next episode on Locked On Grizzlies?
It's one day before the game, and it's one day before, I think, the biggest preseason game of them all. Because one, you're playing the Miami Heat team, which is a very, very good team for one. And then two, Taylor Jenkins has talked about, trying out things with his rotations and things like that. So a lot of the bigger names are still expected to play again in this game. It's the last preseason home game as well. We're going to talk about that as well, and we're going to have some things from practice as well. The Grizzlies will have a practice that we will recap, where we'll talk to Taylor Jenkins and a couple of the players, and I'll have some of those takeaways in here as well.
So make sure you're listening to that episode, as you should be doing every day with Locked On Grizzlies. And again, thanks for making us here at Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball with Josh Lloyd, a tremendous host here on our network. He's the #1 daily fantasy basketball host and show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. So for my wonderful co-host, Damichael Cole with the Commercial Appeal, I am Joe Mullinax. Thank you so much for making us a part of your Memphis Grizzlies fan experience. As always, stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.